Welcome back to the Dairy Knowledge Exchange. I'm Pat Colley, and I'm excited to share a fresh initiative we're launching in 2025 here at D&D Ingredients. Each month, we'll bring an educational webinar on this platform, spotlighting timely industry topics and featuring one of our valued partner products. Make sure to visit the D&D website regularly to explore these new learning opportunities.
My name is Paige Gott, and I'm a Senior Ruminant Technical Manager for DSM Firmenich Animal Nutrition and Health in North America. And today I'm going to share some information related to mycotoxins. What are they and why do we care? So pretty straightforward, but first we'll go through what are mycotoxins, give a lot of introductory information about the fungi that produce them and factors that relate to the production of mycotoxins. And then in the second section, I'll share implications of mycotoxins and why do we care if they're there. So first, a very basic introduction of the word mycotoxins. I think most people are familiar with the root words and can glean the fact that they are produced by fungus and they are poisonous or toxic based on their names, but that's the very base of the root words that go into what a mycotoxin is. So generally they're secondary fungal metabolites that are not necessarily important for the mold to grow and survive, but they're thought to give the mold some sort of competitive advantage against other potential molds or insects, etc., that are trying to colonize a plant or a feedstuff. And there's also thoughts that they can help those molds penetrate the cell wall of the plant tissue to enhance the likelihood that mold can colonize the plant and gain the nutrients from them. And of course, they're detrimental. Generally, there's a lot of things that molds can produce. Penicillin, for instance, some of the antimicrobials were originally isolated from fungus, and those have benefits to them, but we think of the mycotoxins as something that are detrimental and have negative consequences. There's a lot of up and coming research when it comes to mycotoxins, but realistically, they've been around for a very long time, despite them being relatively new in the scope of what we can study and understand. But there's really reports back to the Middle Ages and even biblical times of the negative effects of mycotoxins, especially the ergot alkaloids, which are one category of mycotoxin. You can see in this painting here that was done back in the Middle Ages in the 1500s. The ergot alkaloids were causing a lot of issues in people back then, but they didn't know what the cause was. So they didn't understand why they were having headaches, nausea, hallucinations. And as you can see in the painting, the ergot alkaloids can cause gangrene and loss of the extremities and the tissues. So you can see that in that painting. But back then they didn't understand why that was happening, what was making them sick. Fast forward to the 1960s is when we actually came to the modern age of mycotoxicology, or the study of mycotoxins, and when mycotoxins were first identified and described as the causative agent of those issues that we had observed for many years. The 1960s, again, like I mentioned, is when aflatoxins were actually first discovered. So that's the first of the major mycotoxins that we really think of. Even though, like I mentioned, the issues related to the toxins have been described for many, many years, we didn't have the proper analytical methods and science to be able to measure and detect these toxins. So really relatively recently in the scheme of things is when mycotoxins were first identified and described. And since the 1960s, there's been a tremendous amount of information and learning and identification of additional mycotoxins. So when you look in the literature, you'll see anywhere from 300 to 400 mycotoxins that have been described up to over 1,000. So there are many metabolites out there. And like I said, we are continuing to learn more about mycotoxins all the time. So it's a very popular area of study. One thing that I like to clarify is that mycotoxins are not alive, so they can't be killed. However, the molds that produce them are living organisms, so we can potentially impact the molds and kill the molds off. But unfortunately, those mycotoxins are the compounds that they've potentially produced, and they're very stable and persistent. So once that mold, you can see in this picture of silage, you can see that fuzzy kind of light greenish yellow growth on there. That's an aspergillus mold. If you look at it under the microscope, it looks like this structure that we have here on the right hand side. And those molds can produce a lot of different toxins, just a few of which are shown here. But unfortunately, like I mentioned, once that mold produces the toxins, they're going to be present in that feed stuff or that crop, even if this mold happens to die off after it's produced the toxins. When it comes to mycotoxins, we generally think of 6 main categories of mycotoxins, and then we separate those into whether they originate in the field prior to harvest, so the ones that I have listed up top, or if they're associated with the mold being present and producing those toxins in storage. These designations are not clear-cut black and white. Under the right conditions, your field-related molds and toxins can occur in storage, and actually some of the storage-associated molds are actually found in certain climatic conditions and occur in the field prior to harvest. So looking at the big 6 categories, we think of the trichothecenes, which is a big family that includes various mycotoxins, like deoxynivalenol or vomitoxin that most people are familiar with. Nivalenol is another related metabolite, and there are various other type B trichothecenes. Additionally, in this family are the type A trichothecenes. So they're generally thought to be more potent than our type B related metabolites, and those would include T2 toxin or HT2 toxin that most people are familiar with. But again, there's many more that fall into this family. Next, we have the ergot alkaloids that I already talked about. They're associated with production in the field prior to harvest, fumonazins, and zearalenone. When we look on the storage side, aflatoxins are a big category most people are familiar with because they are highly regulated. And so most people are aware of aflatoxins. If no other mycotoxins are in their vocabulary, they've probably at least heard of aflatoxins. And then ochratoxin A is another storage-associated toxin. But especially we think of aflatoxins occurring potentially in the field in warmer climates. So here in the US, generally in Ohio where I live, we would look at aflatoxins and think of them as a storage issue, but feedstuffs that or crops that are grown in the South could actually have aflatoxins occurring prior to harvest, and it could be a field issue. So again, these designations are not clear cut. An important thing when it comes to mycotoxins is that the molds that produce them generally can produce multiple types of mycotoxins. So on the field side, we talk a lot about our Fusarium species of molds, and those can produce trichothecenes, fumonazins, and zearalenone. So those are very frequently found in combination. If we have one present, there's a good chance that you'll have multiple of those toxins present. Similarly, on the storage side, aspergillus molds can produce both aflatoxins and ochratoxins, among other metabolites, which we'll look at here in a second. Again, this isn't an all-inclusive list of the types of molds and mycotoxins that exist. As you remember, I mentioned that up to potentially 1,000 metabolites have been identified, but these are some other so-called emerging mycotoxins that I'd like you to have some familiarity with. You may have heard of them potentially, if you're really into mycotoxins. But on the field side, Alternaria is another species of mold that we think of occurring in the field prior to harvest. And in addition to those main mycotoxin groups that I mentioned already, the Fusarium molds can produce a wide variety of other metabolites as well that you potentially have heard of, like fusaric acid in niotins, coumarin, etc. Again, not all inclusive, but these are a few that are more studied and understood. On the same thought, when it comes to storage molds, both Aspergillus and Penicillium can produce a wide variety of other toxins as well. Patulin is one you may be familiar with that can actually be produced by both Aspergillus and Penicillium. molds, but there's others as well, like mycophenolic acid, gliotoxin, and so on. So many metabolites that can occur beyond what we routinely screen and test for, and so there's always some uncertainty as to what contamination could be there, since we don't always test for all the metabolites, since we're just not able to with our routine analyses. When it comes to the factors that influence the presence of the molds and the mycotoxins that they may produce, there's a lot that goes into that, but generally we think of climate-related factors, so the temperature and relative humidity and also water activity is really important. Anything that stresses that plant is going to make it more susceptible to being colonized by fungal disease, specifically our mycotoxin-producing molds. We look at the pH and the substrate, so there are differences in what we might see contamination wise when it comes to corn as opposed to the small grains ingredients, or certain grasses can be considered a potential risk for ergot alkaloids, but we don't really think of the main ergot alkaloids occurring in corn, for instance. Obviously, oxygen is important for that mold to be able to grow and survive. And there's actually a lot of research looking at various agronomic practices and how those can influence the risk for the mycotoxin producing molds and the mycotoxins themselves. So factors like crop rotation, tillage type and depth is very interesting space where they found some associations. And then other factors like the planting and harvest day also play a role. Again, those stressors are really important. Anything that stresses the plant makes it more susceptible. So we often think of some of the weather extremes like drought conditions, or when there's times of excessive rainfall or flooding events that occur, that can make a crop more likely to have mycotoxin issues. And of course, anything that damages the plant, whether that's insects, wildlife, hail, or wind, also opens the door to increase the likelihood for contamination. And of course, these factors, like we already mentioned, are important both prior to harvest in the field and once that crop has been harvested and that feed stuff is in storage, all the way through the time of when we're feeding it. There's a potential for contamination to increase up until the time that it is consumed by our livestock. When we look at field versus storage, generally with the testing that we do, especially North America, the vast majority of contamination we see is associated with production in the field. Some reports are that it's 95% of the mycotoxins in feed are produced in the field prior to harvest. So again, the trichothecenes, the fumonazins, and the zearalenone are really a lot of what we think of, especially in North America. But not to be overlooked is the potential, again, for additional accumulation and contamination to occur in storage if there's fungal spores present that can continue to have fungal activity and increase contamination. And some of the fungi are really well adapted to survive in storage, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But it's important to not overlook that potential for storage contamination to occur. There is data that supports the use of mold inhibitors such as propionic acid that can help prevent storage mold growth and mycotoxin production, but that's not going to reduce the contamination that occurred previous to that treatment being applied. So on the graphic here on the left, this is an example if you don't include a mold inhibitor. You can see in the field that we have our mold count increasing and also the toxin levels are increasing. During harvest, that levels off. And initially you'll see a drop in the mold count, that some of those field-associated molds are not going to survive in storage since they're not adapted to those conditions. But if you do have viable mold that can survive, you'll see those counts increase, and with that, you'll see toxin levels potentially increase. In this graphic on the right hand side of the slide, you can see with the addition of a mold inhibitor going into the storage situation that you actually see that mold count decrease in storage, and you'll have those toxin levels just plateau and maintain where they were when they came in from the field, again because you're preventing additional accumulation. So something to keep in mind, especially with weather conditions. Drying practices are really important on the grain side. Corn grain should be dried to less than 15% moisture for short-term storage. And if you plan to store those crops, those grains, dry materials for longer, they should be below 13% moisture to inhibit mold growth and the potential for contamination to continue. I'm a ruminant person, so I like to talk about the potential in silages and forages that we feed on the ruminant side. It also is a popular topic on the producer side, or people that are out in the field and happen to see the colors of the rainbow occasionally growing in their crops. I will say that there's some indication as to what mold it is based on the color, but that's not a definitive answer, that the molds don't always read the textbooks, so they don't always line up with what colors we think they might be. Plus color is, somewhat subjective. So what I call blue green, somebody else might call yellow green, and there's some variation there in how we interpret colors. But generally, penicillium molds are your blue to greenish colored molds, as you can see in this picture on the far left. The Aspergillus species of molds tend to be more of a yellowish green, a lighter color, as opposed to penicillium. And then one of the molds that can occur in storage that we haven't talked about, as it's not thought to be a major mycotoxin producer, is the Meniscus species. Meniscus ruber is the one that's shown here. It can produce citrinin. There is a potential mycotoxin risk there, but that's something to keep in mind, that not all molds produce toxins, but these are some of the ones that we do see occurring in silage in North America. So you might have witnessed some of these colors before. Again, another important point is that not all molds produce mycotoxins. So there's a lot of these whitish, grayish colored molds that maybe are detrimental to the nutritive value. They can reduce palatability and reduce aerobic stability of especially our ensiled forages. But they're not necessarily associated with producing mycotoxins. So not to say they're not an issue, but they're not necessarily a mycotoxin issue typically. But the other thing to keep in mind is that molds are not always producing mycotoxins. So even if they can produce mycotoxins, it doesn't mean that they're always producing them. So just because you see mold doesn't mean that there's necessarily a mycotoxin issue. But of course, like I mentioned, the molds themselves can cause issues related to the nutritive value, and also some health issues as well as a risk, both on the livestock side and on the human side when we're handling moldy feeds. So something to keep in mind. Another challenge with relying on visual inspection to determine if mycotoxins are present or not is that they're usually not evenly distributed in feeds. So you might not be able to see that there is mold growing, just because of, if you think about how much silage is in a bunker, like in this photo, you can only actually visualize a very small portion of how much feed is in that storage vessel. Plus, mold growth can be microscopic, so it might just be growing, but it's not visible to the naked eye. So it's not showing those colors that you're really able to realize readily. And again, the thing that I mentioned, a lot of those field associated molds aren't well adapted to survive in storage. So they'll likely die off and not be growing in your silage or your grain once you go to feed it out. But the toxins that were produced in the field will still be there. So there is still a risk, even if you don't see visible mold growth. So challenge with mycotoxins is the presence of mold doesn't always mean that there's toxins, and the lack of mold doesn't mean that there aren't toxins. So you really need to test to understand what's there. Why do we care? I've talked a lot about mycotoxins and what they are, but what are the real implications? And as I mentioned early on, generally we're concerned about mycotoxins because they're harmful or detrimental as toxins to animals. We do find them in a wide variety of feedstuffs around the world. So basically anything that you or I eat and consume, or that we might feed to our livestock or our pets even, if it's able to provide nutritive value and support mold growth, there is a chance that there could be mycotoxins in those ingredients and feedstuff. So we can find it about anything, really. If you test enough, you will find it. A concern with mycotoxins is that they do cause an extensive economic impact. There's some estimates here from 2003 that annually in the US alone, the estimated impact of mycotoxins is $1.5 billion. That's, taking into consideration crop related costs. The grain producers can be discounted at the elevator when they go to sell. their corn, for instance, if there is contamination or, generally corn that's had diseases and may have mycotoxins would have a lower test weight. So there's different reasons why they might get discounted. Obviously, costs related to mitigation and trying to limit those mycotoxin issues, both on the crop side and on the animal side, add up, as well as testing. Like I mentioned, you need to analyze the samples to understand what toxins are there. So there's a lot of money invested in testing and analyzing for toxins. And then something that's really hard to truly put a dollar value to would be the impact on the livestock side, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But something else to keep in mind, so this $1.5 billion is average. In some years where we have higher mycotoxin pressures, which we do see variation year to year and across regions because of the factors that I mentioned, the weather conditions especially that influence the presence of the molds and the toxins, those change year to year. So in some years, the mycotoxin pressure can be much higher, and this number would be much higher. Additional thing to consider is I told you there's many mycotoxins that exist, but this number is just looking at aflatoxins in corn and peanuts, DON or deoxynivalenol vomitoxin in wheat and corn, and fumonazins in corn. So just 3 of the main mycotoxins and a few of the commodities that we consider, when it comes to feeding livestock. So very, very likely an underestimate of the true economic impact there. And then I do want to call out this map on the right-hand side. This is a map that was included as part of our 2024 World Mycotoxin Survey. So we have the longest running and most comprehensive mycotoxin survey as a company as DSM-Firmenich. It started way back when we were Biomin in 2004. So we're going in, to our 21st year really of the survey this year. And we measure feedstuffs, feed ingredients from around the world and report that every year. The global survey is updated on a quarterly basis, and then there is a year-end report, which is what this map was pulled from. So we will have that coming up again at the end of this year, where we'll have our final results. And then in addition to our global survey, we do I manage our North American survey, where we look at contamination specifically in US and Canadian ingredients. So in addition to that, we do have the more local resource as well. As I mentioned, we find mycotoxins in pretty much anything you want to test. I've highlighted a few of the key ingredients and things that we think about on the livestock side that we feed. Corn, obviously, I think is well recognized as a potential source of mycotoxins. We can find a variety of toxins in corn, as well as corn co-products like distillers grains and corn gluten products. Anything from aflatoxins to DON, fumonazins, zearalenone, type A trichothecenes. Pretty much corn can have any of the toxins that we've talked about, other than really the ergot alkaloids. But the ergot alkaloids are present in small grains and small grain co-products like wheat midds, as well as our other traditional mycotoxins like DON, zearalenone, and ochratoxin A. In some of our different oils we've tested, we find zearalenone typically. Again, I mentioned silages can be a source of contamination. Again, a range of toxins are found in various types of silages, depending on what that silage is actually made from. Generally in the US, we don't think of soy products as being a huge source of contamination, but it can be present. Whether that's DON, zearalenone, ochratoxin A, we see especially in like soy hulls, for instance. Same thought on the side of cottonseed and cotton co-products. There's a risk there, especially based on our historical survey data. We've seen aflatoxins, we've seen T2 toxins, zearalenone, DON, and fumonazins in different cotton products. And then additionally, something that I don't want the ruminant side to overlook is the risk in other forages. Generally, I think most people realize the risk on the grain side, but we do see contamination in the forage side as well, whether that's grasses standing in pasture, straw, hay, or haylage, and those preserved forages can be a source of contamination as well. So don't overlook the potential in silages and other forages that we feed. Challenge with mycotoxins. There are many challenges, but another thing to consider is that generally we can't see them. We can't taste them, and they're very persistent and stable. Another challenge when it comes to the analytical side is they're not typically distributed throughout a feed stuff. Like if you were to analyze some corn for the nutritive value like protein content, that's going to be more consistent throughout your lot of your feed, as opposed to mycotoxins can occur in hot spots and are unevenly distributed typically. And going back again to the thought that you really need to analyze to know what's there. If you look at these 3 piles of corn, most people would say, sure, I would be willing to feed any of those. There's nothing super suspect or questionable about them. But when we actually analyze them for contamination, you can see the sample on the far left has very low levels of DON and was below the limit of detection for zearalenone. The middle sample is a bit higher, that we have, a greater presence of DON or vomitoxin and some zearalenone detected. And then on this far right-hand side, we do have what we would consider a high level of DON or vomitoxin. So we can't just rely on those visual cues alone, because clean looking feeds can potentially be contaminated. But I will say the caveat there is if you see irregular, misshapen, discolored, broken kernels, they are more likely to be contaminated. So if you see something funky, there's a good chance there's contamination there, but don't be misled by the fact that the grain looks clean or normal to you, that there still can be contamination in those situations. Another thing when it comes to going into the negative effects on the animal side, like I mentioned early on, the molds themselves can cause issues. So mycoses are the diseases caused by the fungal infection. This photo here is of ringworm, which is not mycotoxin related, but is a fungal disease that a lot of people unfortunately have some familiarity with. But mycotoxins can cause, or molds themselves can cause issues like abortions as well. So the molds can cause issues, but we're going to focus on the mycotoxicosis or mycotoxicoses. So again, the diseases caused by the toxins themselves. A couple of pictures here might be hard to see. In this picture, there's some skin lesions on this cow. This was a situation in Wisconsin where we found really high levels of trichothecenes, and the cows had lesions, damaged skin all over. And we really tracked it back to the contamination in the diet. And then here you have some sloughed hoof tissue in a situation out of the Dakotas where there were high ergot alkaloids. So, issues that are actually attributed back to the mycotoxins themselves. When it comes to the outcomes in the animals, it's really complex. There's a lot of factors that go into it, similar to the factors that influence the presence of the molds and the mycotoxins. The outcomes we see in the animals are influenced by factors related to the animals themselves, and this is true across species. And even we do see differences across different species and how they react. But age and sex play a role, the health status, the life or production stage plays a role. So again, as a ruminant person, I think a lot about dairy transition animals. They have a lot of other stressors and things that they're dealing with during the transition period. Mycotoxins are an additional stressor that, they're going to be more impacted than a healthy mid-lactation cow that has a bit less pressure and physiologically things going on with that animal. Factors related to the environment. So, of course, the presence of other pathogens or toxins can increase the risk for mycotoxins. Hygiene issues, nutrition program is not up to snuff. You can have challenges, and of course, factors related to management, like overcrowding or heat stress situations on the environmental side can also increase the negative effects of the mycotoxins on an animal. And then, of course, factors related to the mycotoxins themselves play a role. The duration of exposure, the actual toxin type, the contamination, the concentrations plays a role. And then we know that combinations of toxins, which we know are frequent because the molds can produce multiple types of toxins, the likelihood of issues and the outcome in the animals is generally worse when we find multiple toxins present due to the potential additive or synergistic effects of mycotoxins. I won't go through this because this could be a whole presentation on its own, but just know that different mycotoxins have different target organs and tissues and modes of action or mechanisms of action that they utilize to cause their negative effects. So that's why we do see different outcomes depending potentially on what mycotoxins you're dealing with. And then again, the combinations open the door for other detrimental effects from the toxins. So one thing to, I'll talk about zearalenone. It binds and activates estrogen receptors. So that's why we generally think of zearalenone as a reproductive toxin. That's kind of the first one that comes to mind if there's some repro issues. But know that other toxins can play a role as well, like trichothecenes, vomitoxin. Again, Don falls into this family. We often think of digestive disorders and issues with this family, but they inhibit protein and nucleic acid synthesis, so they can have vast consequences because if you think of the importance of protein in the body and all the functions, including protein-based hormones, so it can also impact reproduction as well. There's a lot of potential negative consequences, but generally when we look at mycotoxins, we think of them having negative impacts on the gastrointestinal tract. That's really the first line of defense and the first area of exposure to the toxins as they're ingested in the feed. So a lot of GI issues are considered thought of when it comes to mycotoxins. A lot of the mycotoxins are damaging to the immune system and immune function, leaving those animals more susceptible to disease. And a lot of toxins are also damaging to the liver. The liver is a natural site of detoxification and protective mechanism in the animal. So it's not surprising to know that liver damage is also a common outcome related to various toxins. This is true across species, across production stages. You'll see different issues. I have a lot of them listed out here. We have great resources that are educational in nature to provide this information by species about the different consequences. But, diarrhea is something that we might think of, poor conception rates and irregular heat cycles. Increased risk of cancer is a potential concern, especially in those longer living animals, liver damage and lesions, like I mentioned, death in extreme situations, immune outcomes. When we have less robust immune system, there's an increased risk for diseases. And then, of course, on the performance side, we see a lot of outcomes. We can see alterations in feed intake, poor growth rates, decreased milk production. On the dairy side, a lot of potential outcomes that can be associated and have been associated with mycotoxins. So a lot to keep in mind. When it comes to DSM Firmenich, we offer a lot of support and resources. One thing that we're really big on, which I already mentioned earlier, is our annual mycotoxin survey. So we do offer complementary mycotoxin analyses for customers and prospective customers that are interested in screening their feedstuffs for mycotoxins. It does require a special submission form, so you need to reach out to your DSM Firmenich representative to get the form to make sure that the lab invoices us. And then one of the benefits of working with us is that in addition to those raw results from the lab, we also have one of our experts will send those to you and give you interpretation and try to provide some supportive feedback about what was found. In the US, we primarily work with Romer Labs, which is in Union, Missouri. All of our samples are by default screened for a panel of 18 metabolites via the LC-MS method, which is highly sensitive way to detect mycotoxins. We do have some other advanced more extensive mycotoxin panels to look for some of those other emerging and additional metabolites beyond the 18 that we routinely screen for. So there are some other options that we can look at depending on what issues you're seeing. And, we do a lot of testing when we're troubleshooting issues to try to either rule in or potentially rule out the potential for mycotoxins to be contributing. So we usually reserve these extended panels in troubleshooting situations, but we do a lot of testing with just our routine panel. And all of our data from samples that are submitted purely for surveillance purposes go into our annual mycotoxin survey, which is available here on our website. You can get direct connection to our monthly mycotoxin survey reports for North America. Again, we have separate reports for different corn-based ingredients in the US and also Canada data set as well. And then not to overlook the global survey, which is released quarterly and has the annual report, which I showed you the map from earlier. So looking at a wide variety of ingredients from around the world is very interesting. And again, it's the longest running and most comprehensive mycotoxin survey out there. If you want direct access to our mycotoxin updates, they are included as part of our monthly e-newsletter called the Digest. You can scan this QR code to sign up for that. In addition to mycotoxin related content, we have articles and educational information related to everything that we do at DSM Firmenich. So you can find information related to vitamins, phytogenic feed additives, and other things that we deal with as well, as well as updates, that are just general interest related to important things in the industry, like some of the diseases and challenges that we deal with. There's a lot of really neat articles in our newsletter, the Digest. So I highly recommend signing up for it. We have other additional educational materials that we can share. Again, our mycotoxicoses literature that can help identify and point out some of the signs that you might be seeing in your herd or in the farms you're working with. We have general mycotoxin information, differential diagnosis booklets by species. Again, these are all by species that we have things available on the swine and poultry side as well as a ruminant literature that I've mentioned. And we have, sampling protocols and recommendations. Pretty much anything related to mycotoxins, we have a resource for it. So don't hesitate to reach out to us. In summary, it's important to keep in mind that mycotoxins are detrimental to animal health and productivity, and they contribute to vast economic losses that are often understated because it's difficult to fully incorporate all those potential costs every year. But something we want to be alert to and keep in mind. Again, the contamination can occur in the field prior to harvest or in storage, and usually the mycotoxins aren't evenly distributed. So we need to do some sampling and analyses to really understand what's there when it comes to mycotoxins. There are a wide variety of effects associated with mycotoxins, and they're often non-specific signs. So something to keep in mind if you're troubleshooting issues in a herd or on a farm, consider mycotoxins as part of your differential diagnosis, because they can cause a lot of effects and could be playing a role in the issues you're seeing. And so again, keep in mind monitoring the feed, identifying the challenge, and then coming up with a mitigation strategy. Again, if you're interested in submitting samples as part of our complimentary mycotoxin service and contributing to our annual survey, please don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you for watching this recording, and you can reach out to me directly. Here's my contact info. The QR code will get you also my contact information, or you can follow the link to our mycotoxin survey if you're just interested in those updates and reports. But definitely reach out if you're interested in doing some testing with us, or if you have any questions related to the solutions that we can provide, and anything that DSM Firmenich does, don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to the Dairy Knowledge Exchange. Don't forget to check our product page for featured products and promotions throughout the year. Connect with us on LinkedIn or share your thoughts and topic suggestions directly with me at pat@ddingredient.com. We look forward to hearing from you.